All right, welcome to part two of the weight management discussion. We are going to continue, obviously, where we left off last time. Um, and we'll begin with a little quote from Gary Taubes's Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It book. We've kind of established up until this point, sort of, I guess, dispelling the myths associated with, is overeating causing us to get fat? Is lack of exercise causing us to get fat? Is it too much fat consumption? Um, and so this quote from his book, if reducing calories in doesn't make us lose weight, if increasing calories out doesn't even prevent us from gaining it, maybe we should rethink this whole thing or the whole thing and find out what does. So in his book, and in the dark side, right? We kind of get to this point where it's like, okay, what we've been doing hasn't worked, right? Starving ourselves, exercising more, those aren't the right way to go about it. So let's get creative. Let's get outside of the box, so to speak, and figure out what does work. And so this brings us, I would say, the closest or most directly to chapter 2 in the dark side, right? That's the hormones chapter in the book. You should know that chapter for the upcoming exam associated with this lecture. There's no doubt. So let's talk about regulation of fat in the body. So what are the players in us that determine fat coming into the cells and fat leaving the cells, right? Ultimately, it comes down to hormones and enzymes, and it's really hormones that dictate that run the show. The things that might affect hormones and enzymes and their activity are going to be external things for the most part. Things like stress, things like genetics, sleep, your diet, of course. There's drugs and medications that can affect it. If we get back to my example of puberty, right? Phases of our sort of biological growth clock, right? There's going to be times in our lives, especially up until age 16, 17, 18, where there's going to be signals that turn on those hormones that say, yep, you need to grow. But ultimately, it is hormones that will dictate the rate of flow of fat getting into fat cells. And so we need to understand how these hormones work, what affects those hormones. So consider what controls each one of these factors above, right? And I talk a lot about sleep, not so much in this class, but with my athletes, with my clients. Sleep is such a huge influence on hormonal balance, right? And so sometimes people are just out of whack hormonally, and they're thinking, "Oh, I'm exercising right, I'm eating right, I'm doing everything right." And it's like, "Well, how much do you sleep?" "Oh, well, sleep whatever. I only have a couple hours a night because that's all I can afford." That will mess everything up. And so there are some of these factors on this screen, right? You can't change your genetics, of course, but if you don't consider stress and sleep and diet and drugs and medications and those types of things, toxins, right? That it's going to be really hard to achieve the outcomes you want when it comes to weight management. So let's talk about those hormones. They do control everything. And Sean does a good job on the dark side of really sort of highlighting that. So here's some of the enzymes and hormones that we're going to talk about. So there's groups of hormones that affect hunger. Ghrelin, a hormone released by the stomach. When it's released, it will increase hunger, right? And not just, so the stomach releases it. There's stretch receptors in the stomach that can trigger the release of ghrelin. The hypothalamus can trigger the release of ghrelin in situations where we have low blood sugar. Neuropeptide Y. This is an interesting factor that affects hunger. When neuropeptide Y is released, it not only increases hunger, but it increases cravings or desire. Cravings is probably a better word to consume carbohydrates. And usually it's the sort of the sweeter type. So you've all been in this situation, right? Maybe you're in that situation right now where you're just craving something sweet. Like, a piece of chicken or potato chips, something salty. Nuh-uh. None of those will satisfy my hunger. My hunger right now needs to be something sweet. That's quite often because of neuropeptide Y. Leptin is the third hormone on this list. Leptin is considered the master hormone when it comes to regulating body fat. We've talked briefly about insulin. We're going to talk about insulin again today, but we have like a hormone like insulin as an example. Insulin helps control blood sugar and kind of helps to try and keep it in a narrow range of sort of homeostatic blood sugar levels. Leptin does the same thing, but for body fat. So when body fat creeps up, leptin plays a role. When body fat goes down, leptin can play a role in trying to keep us at what's considered by our body a happy sort of body fat place. There's hormones associated with fat storage. Lipoprotein lipase we've talked about. This is actually an enzyme, and this is an enzyme that breaks down triglycerides in the blood to allow them to enter a fat cell, and then they get reassembled into a triglyceride in the fat cell. Lipoprotein lipase also works the opposite direction. It works inside the cells to break down a triglyceride, to liberate it and release it into the blood. So it kind of is a bidirectional type of enzyme. But lipoprotein lipase, like a lot of enzymes, it doesn't call the shots. There's hormones that will tell lipoprotein lipase to do its job. Insulin is one of them. The presence of insulin will increase fat storage, hands down, right? Insulin helps things, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, get into the cells. And so the presence of insulin can really play a role in increasing fat storage. And it also, on the side, decreases fat breakdown, so fat catabolism. We do have some things that increase the breakdown of fat. And so we have glucagon, which is sort of that antagonist to insulin, right? Insulin brings sugar into the cells, glucagon releases it, and it does so often by also liberating fat. There's a hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase, HSL. This is an important one. This is the hormone that helps direct lipoprotein lipase to liberate triglycerides from fat cells and release them into the blood and for metabolic purposes. So HSL activity is a pretty big deal in this equation. That being said, and these are a lot of hormones that are still under the sort of direction of other factors. And so we have hormones associated with just general metabolism, like what's calling the shots, what's dictating how much energy our body is utilizing throughout the day just for normal physiological function. That would be our thyroid hormones. And we don't get too deep into them in this class at all, because that's getting sort of outside the span of our reach, so to speak. But the thyroid hormones, their activity can and will dictate metabolism. So a good quote from Sean's book: any attempt to lose fat without proper hormonal balance will be in vain. In other words, until the hormones are balanced, doesn't matter what you do. They will dictate hunger. They will dictate flow of fat into and out of cells. If they're messed up, we have no chance of beating them. Even if you try and starve yourself or do whatever you're trying to do, it's a very, very difficult and pretty much no-win situation. So let's talk a little bit about fat, right? So body fat plays a role in our body. And so in this conversation about weight management, we got to talk about what fat does. So Sean calls it our starvation defense system. And that's a fair thing to say, right? And we look at different animals. There's a lot of animals that will really fatten up for certain times of the year so they can do their hibernation type of thing. Yeah, that's what they're getting fat for, to give themselves a reserve to survive a situation where they might otherwise starve, right? And so fat was for a very long time considered just a static cell, meaning it's just fat cells, it's just energy. When the energy is needed, it's liberated, but it doesn't do anything else. Well, it was discovered that fat is actually considered like a gland, and it secretes this hormone called leptin. And I think leptin wasn't discovered until the 1950s or 60s. Very, very recent in terms of sort of the medical world. It's like, what? How do we go so long without knowing this? So leptin is a hormone secreted by fat, and leptin's role is to monitor and regulate fat storage or storage fat levels. And so leptin is released from the fat in proportion to what percent body fat or how much fat we have on our body. So if you have, if you're an individual with 20 pounds of fat on your body, you're going to release X amount of leptin. If you go from 20 to 40 pounds of fat on your body, you're going to be releasing twice the amount of leptin. Or if you go from 20 pounds of fat on your body to 10 pounds, you're going to be releasing about half the amount of leptin. So leptin levels are directly related to body fat levels. When we have high fat levels, so when the higher the fat levels in our body, the higher the leptin is released. Leptin's presence, so what leptin does to our body's physiology as a hormone, it has to do something, right? It communicates with our hypothalamus, by the way, and when the leptin reaches the hypothalamus will say, well, this is a high amount of leptin. Leptin will then cause a decrease in hunger and an increase in metabolism. Kind of makes sense, right? If you have high fat levels, the body will act to decrease those fat levels. And the primary means your body has to do that is, hey, stop eating. Fat storage is high enough. And let's burn some extra energy by increasing metabolism. So that's the response of the hypothalamus to high leptin levels. We'll see hormonally that there's less ghrelin release, there's less neuropeptide Y, and also in a hormone we haven't talked about much, cortisol also goes down. Cortisol can lead to increased fat storage as well. So high leptin levels equals our body's strategy to decrease fat levels, and because we have excess energy stored. Conversely, if leptin levels drop, we have been on the show Survivor for 39 days and our body fat levels are way lower than they should be. What does it do? Well, it communicates with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus goes, whoop, not enough leptin going on. Let's get hungrier and let's decrease metabolism. So let's make it so we want to sleep all day, be lazier. And man, if there's food around, you got to put it down, right? So put it down, meaning you got to eat it. And so the response by the hypothalamus, it will increase ghrelin release, it'll increase MPY release, and it'll increase cortisol release. So all three factors that will decrease metabolism and increase hunger. Sean uses some graphics in his book. The picture got slid over a little bit, not a big deal, of the relationship between leptin and the hypothalamus. And so if we have normal amount of leptin communicating to the brain, we have our fat cells. Yep, this is just the right amount apparently. It communicates with the hypothalamus. Everything is good. The hypothalamus doesn't decrease or increase hunger. We're happy. If we have less leptin talking to the brain, so body fat stores go down. My survivor example, right? You've lost all this body fat. Less leptin's getting to the brain. The brain responds by thinking, well, there's not enough fat, so let's slow down metabolism, increase appetite. With all this being said, hopefully, surely some of you are going, well, then how in the heck do we ever get fat? If we have this control mechanism in place, surely there's something must get messed up because some people do get fat, right? And so the answer is yes. Like almost any hormone in our body, leptin can lose its effectiveness as a hormone by something called leptin resistance. And this is where the relationship between leptin and the leptin receptors on the hypothalamus get messed up somehow, right? Leptin can't communicate with the hypothalamus anymore, so the hypothalamus is thinking, wow, there's no more leptin around. So the hypothalamus, if it becomes unresponsive to leptin, it will assume that you have lost a tremendous amount of body fat. And what does a hypothalamus do if it thinks that there's no leptin? Yeah, just what we talked about on the previous slide. If the hypothalamus thinks there's no leptin, it'll increase hunger and decrease metabolism. Now, there could be plenty of leptin going around in this situation, right? Hey, I have tons of leptin, my body fat is really high, but the hypothalamus doesn't get the message. And so that's what leptin resistance is. The same thing happens with insulin. We'll talk about insulin resistance later, but leptin resistance is a situation where normal or high leptin levels, whatever the leptin levels are, the message is not received by the hypothalamus, and therefore the consequence is as if we had low body fat, increased hunger, decreased metabolism. It's not entirely clear what specifically causes leptin resistance. It's usually a multitude of factors. The things associated with leptin resistance include episodes of overeating. And so overeating itself, and so massive amounts of energy coming in can cause leptin resistance. Blood sugar rushes. So not only overeating, but overeating your cake and ice cream or whatever it is, these high refined carbohydrate foods that cause rushes of blood sugar, that can cause leptin resistance. Having high blood triglycerides, which is usually a consequence of too many carbohydrates, so then triglycerides being dumped in the blood from the liver, but high blood triglycerides have an association with leptin resistance. Excessive fructose consumption, hopefully the little light bulb is going, oh yeah, fructose, pretty common in things, highly processed foods such as sodas and other types of sugary foods. Our fructose consumption over the decades has quadrupled and then some. And so fructose has a relationship to leptin resistance. And then we get into lifestyle factors, chronic stress. And so chronic stress, does that mean lack of sleep can play a role as well? Yes. Multiple sort of lifestyle factors can get in there. So leptin resistance is a little bit elusive in terms of exactly what causes it. It's usually a combination of those things. So So we're looking at some dark side graphics again. If we have extra leptin levels, the communication with the brain, the hypothalamus is like, whoa, that's a lot of leptin. Body fat levels must be too high. Let's bring it down a little bit. So the metabolism goes up, appetite goes down. In a situation of leptin resistance, then we do have this situation, where body fat levels are going up, leptin levels are probably going up, but there's something blocking that leptin resistance. And so therefore the hypothalamus is assuming, because it doesn't get the message, that we are low on body fat, so it does drop metabolism and increase appetite. So there's leptin. It's a pretty big deal in this whole equation. Again, if we don't control the sensitivity to leptin, if we don't manage it, efforts to try and starve yourself, exercise more, all those things are going to be in vain. Let's talk about insulin. Insulin gets a lot of attention. We know about insulin. We've known about insulin for quite a long time, much longer than we've known about leptin. And insulin has mostly been discussed and investigated in its role with management of blood sugar and diabetes. So insulin's not the enemy. And lately it's been getting the blame for, the reason you're gaining fat is because of insulin. And it's not. Insulin has a role. If we didn't have insulin, we would be sick. We'd have diabetes, and that is very dangerous. So insulin plays some really, really important roles for like every hormone in our body to keep us healthy and functioning right. So why is it getting why are fingers being pointed at leptin as being the cause? Well, it does have an association with fat metabolism and getting fat into the cells. So insulin's a regulator of blood glucose. Absolutely. It increases the uptake of glucose and fat and proteins into our cells. And so when insulin is present, it does decrease fat metabolism, right? You think if insulin is being secreted, that must mean that we have carbohydrates in our blood. True. If we have carbohydrates in our blood, should we keep breaking down fat as an energy source? No, we should be breaking down carbohydrates. We have that readily available source of energy there. So stop breaking down fat, start breaking down carbohydrates. And so the presence of insulin, it's not insulin's fault, but the presence of carbohydrates, which are causing the insulin to go up, maybe it's the carb's fault. So the presence of insulin will reduce fat metabolism and help get fat into fat cells. And so this is, again, where carbs also get blamed for making you fat. High intake of carbohydrates equals high insulin levels, which equals high uptake of fat into cells and low fat metabolism. So yes, carbohydrate foods increase blood sugar and increase insulin release. And so what we see is that with high carbohydrate intake, that glycogen storage in our muscles and liver will go up, right? We maximize the amount of carbohydrate stored in our body. We can't store very much, right? We talked about that briefly a couple times this term. We can't store very many carbohydrates. And so once we exceed our ability to store carbohydrates as carbohydrates, then we will start storing carbohydrates as fat. We're going to try, right? Fat breakdown will stop. We're going to do other things to try and deal with it, but carbohydrates can and will get converted to fat. Lipoprotein lipase plays a role in that process without a doubt. This will happen regardless of calorie status, which means if we are full of glycogen, right? And so let's say we don't eat much, but our glycogen stores are full. We don't exercise much. There's not much glycogen being used for glycolysis, right? We can still be in a caloric deficit, meaning I consume less than I burn on a daily basis, but what I'm consuming is high carbohydrates, and therefore my storage of carbohydrates is full. It'll still slow down fat metabolism, and it'll still store those excess carbs as fat. That can be a problem. So the relationship of insulin to fat storage, it's there. Like with leptin, insulin resistance is also a thing. And insulin resistance can cause some additional problems when it comes to fat storage, in addition to things like diabetes and blood glucose regulation. So insulin has receptors on muscle tissue, liver tissue, and on adipose tissue, fat tissue, right? Muscle and liver insulin receptors are a little bit more susceptible to losing sensitivity compared to adipose tissue. So in other words, when we start to develop what's called insulin resistance, and this is when insulin doesn't communicate with its receptors, therefore insulin isn't doing its job, the muscles and liver will get resistant to insulin more quickly. Overuse of those receptors, certain drugs, certain toxins, there's multiple factors that can lead to this, but the muscle and liver receptors will get insulin resistance before adipose receptors will. And so adipose receptors for glucose uptake are considered resistance resistant. I know that's sort of a tongue twister, but what we're saying is that the fat cells take longer to get resistant to insulin. So if the muscle and liver aren't getting the insulin message and the fat cells are, guess what happens? A lot more of the carbohydrates and fats are going into the fat cells. Muscle and liver stop taking it in. So the likelihood then of us gaining fat in an insulin resistant situation is increased compared to when we have normal sort of relationship between insulin and its receptors. So the causes of insulin receptor resistance are unclear. Again, it's still somewhat elusive, just like with leptin resistance. We know there's some factors associated with why we become insulin resistant. Diet plays a role, high sugar diets, binge eating types of things, repeated high sugar meals over not just a couple of days, but we're talking years and years. We can see the burnout or the lack of sensitivity from overuse of these receptors. Genetics plays a role. Physical activity, the less physically active we are, the more likely we are to get insulin resistant. And there's certain toxins in our environment that can also play a role in the relationship between insulin and its receptors. So what happens now if we become insulin resistant? Well, our body has some strategies. And first, if the body knows, okay, glucose levels in our blood are still too high, so we're going to keep increasing insulin release. And so the pancreas cranks out more and more insulin because the glucose isn't getting into the cells. And so that increased insulin will increase the lipoprotein lipase activity, which means most likely more fat into the cells. It'll decrease glucagon and HSL, hormone-sensitive lipase activity. Remember, that's the two hormones associated with burning and utilizing, breaking down fats. And then that last bullet, it'll decrease fat metabolism. And insulin is a very inflammatory hormone, which can lead to that inflammation can lead to things like increased cholesterol. It can lead to increased cortisol production. Cortisol is a stress hormone that leads to increased fat gaining. It's a whole cascade, right? You can see sort of this slow explosion of, oh man, increased insulin can lead to a whole bunch of other factors, including excess fat gain. So insulin resistance is a problem. So how do we avoid insulin resistance and leptin resistance? Well, there's some strategies, right? And they don't have to be medically based for sure. They're mostly lifestyle associated, right? And so getting to consuming a diet that helps regulate blood sugar is a big deal. So, avoiding excessive refined carbohydrates, avoiding excessive sweets and sugars. That sometimes includes fruit, right? And so I have conversations with a lot of my athletes about, places like Jamba Juice and smoothies. You can do smoothies right, but you can also do them wrong. And you look at places like Jamba Juice, and a lot of their smoothies are very, very, very high in sugar. We're talking over 100 grams of sugar in some of those. That's an insane load of sugar on your body, causing incredibly high load of these simple carbohydrates. Not necessarily the best idea. And like I said, it's not every smoothie, and you can do them right and you can do them wrong, but being mindful of foods that are going to cause high blood sugar responses and eating less of them, right? So we're talking foods that are balanced, a balance of protein and fat with the carbohydrates, decreasing the refined carbohydrate consumption. Decreasing sugar consumption is a no-brainer for people, even if you aren't concerned about insulin resistance. Just stop eating sugar, right? Make lifestyle choices that don't overstress the body. And so this is, again, lifestyle choices that are going to cause less stress hormones, less stress on the body, generally speaking. That will lead to less likelihood of leptin and insulin resistance. Again, balancing meals. The less insulin that we have to rely on for metabolism and normal physiological function, the better off we are. So balance is by far a key factor here. And even still, sometimes it's hard to beat. So all right, so kind of turning the page now. That's it on hormones, right? And so know those hormones. Again, the exams associated with this are going to come a lot more from the slides because we're not paying much attention to things. So it's going to be the slides on dark side of fat loss. Let's turn the page and talk about diets. And so another quote from Taubes, which we've already mentioned, right? Oh, no, we didn't. If overeating and lack of exercise are not the cause of obesity, then the opposite can't be the cure. Yeah, we did have this one earlier, right? So what's our strategy to lose weight? Well, it's the box, right? You ask most people, what's the best way for you to lose weight? Oh, I just need to start exercising more and probably eat a little bit less. I've been eating a lot lately. So it is the box, right? And Sean talks about the box quite a bit. And so our strategy to lose weight is the same exact strategy that will make us hungry. Hey, if you eat less, yeah, your body's going to get hungry, right? It recognizes the lack of energy coming in. They were going to have a drop in leptin. And so one thing that I didn't mention about leptin is a sort of a long-term sort of management uh, of these hormones, right? But it's also a short-term thing. And so even in shorter, if you consume a massive amount of food and you overeat for a day, it will increase leptin levels in the short term. And if you eat less, it's going to decrease leptin levels in the short term. Not as dramatically as changes in body fat levels will, but it does take time for body fat levels to change. So there are even just acute levels and changes, of leptin. And so if we decrease energy intake or if we exercise more, that will make us hungry. Does this address the cause of us gaining fat if that's what we're really after? Probably not, right? We've already established that overeating and lack of exercise aren't the cause. So what are some other weight loss strategies that we can employ? And this is right. This is an industry in our country that is a multi-billion-dollar thing, right? I mean, there's thousands of diet books and other exercise types of books that are going to say, yeah, this is how you're going to lose weight and this is how you're going to keep it off. The purpose of a diet and of a strategy should be long-term. In other words, yeah, I can put somebody in the box, and I do occasionally for sort of emergency weight loss situations. I'll have an athlete go, yeah, you need to lose 10 pounds in X amount of time. That's very short. We're going to have to deprive you. Don't ever like to do it. It's not a good strategy. I know that. I recognize that. And it's not a long-term strategy. But you can starve somebody for a few weeks, and they'll lose some weight when you starve them. But the consequence of that short-term strategy usually leads to long-term bigger issues. So we're always looking for a diet or some sort of program to be long-term. Let's make it long-term. And that's one of the challenges in the research world when it comes to looking at diets. You can't force people into these lab situations under a controlled diet to do it for years and years, right? And so can you get somebody to eat less and exercise more for 6 months? Yeah. And then we compare that to other strategies and we're like, oh, you know what? They all equal really successful weight loss. So the box does work. The box can work for 6 months, maybe even a year, but we're looking 2, 3, 4 years out, not so much. So what do the experts say about dieting? Well, research on the effectiveness of diet and exercise revealed pretty poor results, especially in the long term, right? Why do we continue to prescribe this technique? It's because they work in the short term. And that is really, really hard barrier for us to overcome. Hey, my friend lost 80 pounds in 6 months doing starvation diet. Well, that's amazing, right? And so because we see results in the short term, then people go, oh, well, the reason it didn't work for you in the long term is just you didn't have the willpower. You didn't have the strength to continue doing what got you to that place, right? Or you got to a certain goal and then you just stopped. You just needed to continue. And so that's really misleading and part of, I think, why we have this perpetual attempt to use diet and exercise as a tool because we do see short-term success. Here's some other quotes. So although long-term follow-up data are meager, I mean, there isn't much because people don't typically do this, the data that do exist suggest almost complete relapse after 3 to 5 years, meaning after 3 to 5 years after a diet and an exercise type of strategy to lose weight, if we look at these individuals after these successful programs, 3 to 5 years later, we see complete relapse, meaning that individuals gain their weight back. The paucity of data provided by the weight loss industry has been inadequate or inconclusive. So the weight loss industry has a financial motivation, and I'm not saying this is intentional or not, it could be subconscious, but the motivation of the weight loss industry to do follow-up research on their diets and, hey, I have this diet plan, I'm going to help you lose 2 dress sizes in 2 weeks. Why would I follow up a year later to see if those people who I help, put them on a liquid diet of 50 calories a day for a month, of course they're going to lose weight. I don't want to follow up a year later because then the results are going to be very, very not what I want. So a little bit more from the experts. So a panel of experts convened by the National Institute of Health, the NIH, determined that in controlled settings, participants who remained in weight loss programs usually lose approximately 10% of their weight. That's actually really awesome. The research shows us losing 10% of your weight, if you're overweight to begin with or obese, that will equal positive health outcomes, assuming that you can keep that 10% off. However, 1/3 to 2/3 of the weight is regained within 1 year after weight loss, and almost all is regained within 5 years. So this is a failing strategy, right? We can get somebody to lose weight for a year or two, but if everybody almost regains it within 5 years, is that what we want? And the answer should be no. We don't want this effect of, I'm going to gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight. We don't want that, right? Finally, consider the Women's Health Initiative, the largest and longest controlled randomized dietary intervention. It's designed to test the current sort of recommendations for weight loss, which is eat less, exercise more. More than 20,000 women in this study maintained a low-fat diet, reducing their calorie intake by an average of 360 calories a day. Not bad. And increasing their physical activity. After 8 years on this diet, there was almost no change in weight, an average loss of 0.1 kg. So basically an average loss of less than like a quarter pound. An average waist circumference, which is a measure of abdominal fat, actually increased over this time. So here we have some evidence. Let's put people in the box. 8 years, 20,000 women in the box, eating less, exercising more. What was the outcome to them? They didn't lose any weight, which I guess they didn't gain any weight, which maybe is a good thing, but they actually gained a little bit of waist circumference. So it didn't really stop the process completely, but it definitely didn't improve it much, especially if these individuals were already obese to begin with. So there's, is this the winning long-term strategy? Probably not. So issues about how diets make you fat, and we've identified these causes already in a way, but I'll still repeat them now. So calorie restriction can lead to increased use of fat as a fuel source. So starving yourself can be a good thing, right? Fasting, I'm a big fan. I'm a big supporter of fasting. Fasting will increase your body's reliance on fat as an energy source. That's a good thing. The hypothalamus will sense the increased use of fat stores. And so it'll tell the thyroid glands, slow metabolism down because we're using fat as an energy source. We don't want it to decrease. This has to do with leptin as well. And so the hypothalamus is in control of things, going, we're burning through a bunch of fat. Let's slow our human down a bit. We don't want to die of starvation. Fat is our starvation defense mechanism. So the hypothalamus will also then say, we're burning through this fat. Let's increase ghrelin release. Let's increase neuropeptide Y to get some more energy coming in so we can slow down this use of fat as an energy source. So the diet part of diet and exercise, calorie restriction, yes, on the surface, it does increase fat metabolism. That can be a good thing. But in the long term, it's going to make us hungry and probably hungry for carbs. So what do we do if we don't, if we wait? We continue to stay hungry. So calorie restriction isn't necessarily a successful thing to do. We don't want to have to deal with hunger. How long can you go managing hunger, being hungry all the time? That life is too short. Life is too short to be hungry forever. We've talked about exercise as well. Exercise will increase hunger. We have that overcompensation effect. And we tend to move less on those days, which I would argue leads to less positive physiological adaptations, right? The use it or lose it principles in play. The more sedentary you are, the less positive that is. So for me to get back now on exercise a little bit and talk about the specific types, generally speaking, the types of exercise that cause the greatest amount of increase in hunger is going to be cardiovascular exercise. We're talking the low to moderate intensity, walking, jogging, cycling, stair mill, elliptical trainer kind of stuff. The type that gets your heart rate up a bit, right? Moderate intensity stuff. It gets you doing a little bit of a sweat. Definitely burning probably more fat than carbohydrates, depending on how fit you are and what you're doing. That's the type of exercise that can lead to the greatest increases in hunger, the greatest potential for overcompensation. Research has been done on this. So let's compare cardio to other types of exercise. And what's starting to shine through as a very, very positive type of exercise to help with not only weight management, but a whole bunch of other cool things, is high intensity interval training, or often referred to as HIIT training. Assuming you're all, or knowing most of you are kinesiology majors, you've probably had a class that's discussed different types of exercise. High intensity interval training has been around for a while, and the research on it has been really ramped up the last probably 10 years. Just to mention one of many studies. So they did a study where they had individuals just do cardiovascular training. We're talking moderate intensity stuff, 30 minutes, 40 minutes on the treadmill. What they found is that the caloric deficit induced, so they put these people in the box for 16 days, basically, exercise more, eat less, that the exercise intervention, the burning more calories from cardio, didn't change hunger, it didn't change metabolism for the first 16 days. After 16 days, the body starts to recognize this pattern, right? And so our bodies, again, some things take time to kick in. So, hey, I've been training for 2 weeks. I'm still on my diet. This is great. I'm losing weight. The body starts to adjust. And so after 16 days, we saw the effects of overcompensation and decreased metabolism start to kick in. So individuals started to eat more, and they started to move less throughout the day. And so it took a little while for cardio to kick in. But once it did, then we dealt with all those typical issues that I would mention on the previous handful of slides, right? Less movement throughout the day, more hunger, overcompensation, all that kind of stuff. That's just with cardio exercise only. On the flip side, high intensity interval training leads to actual appetite suppression. And some of you that do interval training, whether you do it on purpose or not, some of you are athletes on teams where you got to do, sprints and all these types of efforts to train for your events, or if you just do them for the purpose of high intensity interval training. CrossFit uses a lot of HIIT training for those of you that do CrossFit. This leads to an appetite suppression, and it has to do with a lot of the hormones that are released in response to exercise and the intensity of exercise. These are hormones that aren't released when we do the cardio and when we do the lower intensity stuff. So the high intensity efforts, very high. I mean, people get nauseated to the point where appetite is suppressed that much. And so we find that the overcompensation effect with high intensity interval training doesn't exist. And that's a big deal, right? Especially when we're starting to point the finger at what's causing us to overeat. Yeah, there's hormones and all these other things. Sometimes it's exercise. Well, that eliminates exercise as being a cause of us overcompensating for the energy that we expend throughout the day. Other positive things associated with high interval, the HIIT training is insulin sensitivity is improved. And so one thing that happens is this really, really high intensity exercise, it burns through carbohydrates, it brings carbohydrates into the cells, and ultimately what we find is that we're seeing improvement in people who are pre-diabetic and who have diabetes by doing high intensity interval training. It's really exciting stuff because this is almost a medical, when we talk about exercise as medicine, and surely you do in some of your other kines classes. Exercise is medicine. In this case, high intensity interval training acts like a dose of insulin, and it really actually helps insulin sensitivity. So people trying to manage things like prediabetes and diabetes get great benefit from this type of training, much, much better than just doing cardio alone. Not to say cardio is bad, but when we're talking specifically in terms of insulin sensitivity and weight management, the HIIT training stands out as being much better. So, so this slide is I always feel like it's misplaced in this lecture. So I just need to talk about it, and it could have come anywhere. Sean talks about it a bit in his book as well. The 3,500 calorie myth. And so there is this idea where, this calorie math thing, and if you eat 3,500 extra calories more than you burn, you're going to gain a pound of fat. Or if you eat 3,500 calories less than you burn, you're going to lose a pound of fat. Well, that's a no-brainer. If I burn 3,500 calories a day and I fast for that day, do I lose a pound of fat? The answer is no, you don't. The body makes up for it, right? And so there's multiple examples. I'm not going to get into it much. We've mentioned some of it earlier. Zoe Harcum, Dr. Zoe Harcum, she's from Great Britain, has dedicated her professional sort of research studies and a lot of her professional work in sort of dispelling this 3,500 calorie myth. Where it came from is not clearly understood. It's not supported by any research. Why would we think that depriving ourselves of 3,500 calories would equal a pound of fat loss? Yeah, it's kind of a mystery. So getting away from this whole calorie idea and really getting away from calorie counting, I think is an important way to go, because calorie counting is obviously, and we've talked about this already in the class, isn't an exact science to begin with. And so that really just causes more stress than it does any good. So finally, what's making us fat, right? We've identified it. And if I ask you this now, you could probably tell me quite easily, right? But if we almost as a summary, what's making us fat? Well, if we look at our diet, the easiest things to point to: overconsumption of refined carbohydrates and highly processed foods, getting away from the stuff that's been messed with too much, right? And this isn't just high carbohydrate foods, it's highly processed foods in general. Things that have been manipulated, fried, had chemicals added to them that have been bleached, that have been, just messed with. But again, refined carbohydrates are definitely on the top of the list, but it counts for foods high in fat as well, and manipulated and refined and processed fats as well. So we're talking about high glycemic index foods, empty calories from vegetable oils, and then issues that can lead to leptin and insulin resistance, right? Other factors that are going to be leading to us getting fat, well, they're hormonally associated, right? What types of things are you doing to yourself that might knock you out of hormonal balance? Things that affect insulin and leptin resistance, things that might affect your thyroid function, which can also control metabolism, which can then also control leptin and insulin, right? So things like stress in your life, lack of sleep, lack of exercise, the right type of exercise, being exposed to toxins in your environment. And so there's a whole bunch of things that can contribute to what's making us fat. But I think at the end of the day, right, choosing that cleaner sort of dietary approach and eating foods that are closest to nature, jerfing, right? Just eat real foods. There is this graphic, and so this is from shift.com. It's the obesity system influence diagram, and I'm not going to test you on it, but I'm fascinated by it as a physiologist, exercise physiologist. I'm obsessed and maybe really intrigued by relationships and how the body, one thing can affect another thing in the body that connects to something else. Well, this graphic by shift.com or shiftn.com, sorry, shows us the influences on obesity. And so it has what's called a core loop, where it has all these clusters. You can see they're being highlighted. So psychology is one of them, social psychology, food production, physiology, individual physiology, and just general physiology, activity environment. And so it connects all these dots, and I should be able to zoom in on some of them. Again, if you're into this kind of stuff, it's kind of fun to check out. It's like, oh yeah, food abundance. Yeah, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. Visit the website. It's kind of fun to click around. Again, if you have a passion for this, this can help answer some questions and present some questions. So what do we do? Is there an optimal fat loss diet? Well, I think the general answer is no. I think there's some diets presenting themselves to be more effective than others. I'm a supporter of low carbohydrate ketogenic diets for multiple reasons. I think they have some additional health benefits. I think they're more sustainable in the long term, which we talked a little bit about in the fat discussion. And I think the outcomes on keto tend to be more positive than what I've seen individuals trying low-fat diets and other types of diets. So there are low-fat diets out there. Some people find long-term success on them. I'm not gonna fall into that sort of corner of saying, oh yeah, this is the best. There isn't a best. Again, I want to overstress hormonal balance, eating as close to nature as possible. That's going to, getting healthy, then fat loss will come. Don't go the other way around. There's this things called elimination diets where you just eliminate a food group or eliminate multiple food groups for a certain amount of time to achieve certain goals. They're okay, I guess, depends. There's other diets out there, blood type diet, paleo diet. Oh, there's so many, right? Is there an optimal one? I'm just going to say no. The lifestyle is maybe a little bit easier to address, right? We know that if you can manage stress effectively and not live a stressed out lifestyle, that'll have positive effects not only on your psychological well-being, but your physical and physiological as well. We have less stress hormones being released. Those stress hormones can lead to that whole cascade of increased fat gain, right? Exercise. Exercise should include both cardio and resistance training, and in addition to high-intensity interval training. Yeah, those are all part of optimum health. There is some research out there on the low-fat versus low-carb diets. A lot of them are pretty short-term, 3 months, 6 months. There's a couple of them that compare year-long studies. Most of them equal about the same amount of fat loss over that same amount of time. And I think our bodies are relatively resistant in a big picture to lose more fat than is physiologically possible. So we can starve ourselves or we can feed ourselves in different ways. The ketogenic diet is typically a way of feeding ourselves to lose fat, and that's how I look at it. We feed ourselves the right type of calories to encourage increased fat metabolism and therefore increase fat loss over time. And that to me is the ketogenic diet. We're not providing our body with carbohydrates to burn carbohydrates as an energy source. We provide our body with fat, and that providing our body with fat as an energy source increases fat breakdown. That is my at least philosophy and how I share it with my clients. We're going to eat to lose fat. Low carb is we're going to starve ourselves to lose fat. Again, two different strategies. Depends on the individual and how they may or may not be successful on one. So a lot of confusion. What is low carb by definition? What is low fat by definition? Yeah, there's no specific definition, right? People define it how they want. So generally, low carbohydrate is less than 50 grams of carbs per day. Low fat is usually in the neighborhood of less than 15 or 10% of fat in the diet. So what we see generally with the keto diets, the low carb diets, is that we do see improved blood markers, things like triglycerides and HDL cholesterol are improved. We see better blood pressure and decreased waist circumference with these types of diets. So there are some other, like I said, increased health benefits with them. So the best diet does get back to jerfing, of course. There's no question about it. Carbohydrates should be, for everyone, regardless of weight status and trying to manage weight, should be a food that should be adjusted, right? If you are not highly active, you don't need a lot of gasoline in your engine, and therefore you don't need a lot of carbohydrates. If you're highly active, you should be eating more carbohydrates. I think that's generally a good strategy to use. So if you are that sedentary person with a low metabolism as it is, because you just don't do much, you don't need to fuel your tank up with a couple thousand calories a day of carbohydrates. It just doesn't make sense. That will ultimately cause some challenges. So when it comes to short-term weight loss, and I mentioned this earlier, and so I put this slide in here, right? There are ways to lose short-term weight, but that usually requires a pretty good amount of deprivation. I don't like to deprive my athletes or clients ever of energy and nutrients. It's a tricky thing, right? But for short-term weight loss, sometimes there aren't other sort of options. And so calorie restriction and reduction is usually at the basis of short-term strategies to lose weight. The idea then is to minimize the potential effect of that reduction, of that deprivation. So making sure nutrient intake is good. So looking at vitamins and minerals, their intake. I always make sure that protein intake is adequate. We want to make sure that the materials are there to help adapt and recover from training, and protein becomes a big part of that. Some carbohydrates need to be part of the equation, so sometimes fat and carb intake decreases. You don't want to deprive yourselves or your athletes or your clients too much, and so more than 1,000 calorie deficit per day, that's crossing a line basically. So don't over deprive your individuals of energy. If caloric deficit is too much, the body still needs energy for recovery and for normal physiological function. It'll typically go to breaking down proteins to provide energy for certain and even nutrients for certain functions, and that ultimately can lead to some negative outcomes when it comes to health and performance. So, and finally, let's talk for a slide about weight gain. I don't talk much about it, and there are situations where I deal with my athletes and my clients to try and help them gain weight. This is usually easily done, although there's some people that really struggle. At the end of the day, to gain muscle, and it's usually muscle that individuals want to gain. I've never dealt with anybody trying to gain fat. I'm sure there's situations where people try and do that, but it's usually, I want to gain some muscle mass. I want to gain some protein mass. At the beginning of the conversation, even though it's the last bullet on the slide, there needs to be that stimulus for the body to want to grow. You can't just go, you know what, I'm going to start eating more protein, and therefore my muscles are going to grow. Just like with fat, we need the stimulus to be triggered for our body to want to gain muscle. we don't just gain muscle by eating more protein, just like we don't gain fat by eating more fat, right? And I hope that makes sense at this point. So to gain muscle, we need that stimulus. The stimulus is going to be associated with exercise and using those muscles in a way that want the body to increase the expression or the uptake of proteins into those muscles, right? And that we get into heat shock proteins and all these other types of things, not for this class necessarily, but the stimulus needs to be there. We need to usually manipulate weights, not take steroids, manipulate weights, exercise hard to do it. To then support the increase in muscle mass, a hypercaloric diet, so consuming some excess calories compared to what is burned, isn't always necessary, but it is ensuring that the outcome will be positive. If we know how to use nutrient timing, meaning that we consume proteins and carbohydrates at the right time to help maximize recovery of the muscles being used and stimulate growth, we can get away with an isocaloric diet, meaning we're consuming about the same amount that we burn. If we go hypocaloric, meaning we're consuming less than we burn, our body is very much less likely to put on some protein mass. So to err on the side of caution, eat more than you're burning if you're trying to gain muscle. Does that mean you might gain a little bit of fat in the process? It depends on what you're eating more of. If you're just eating more protein and fats and not carbohydrates, probably not. But occasionally a little excess fat might come with that equation. It just depends. So fat does not play that much of a role in helping with gaining muscle. It is carbohydrates and protein. Carbohydrates and proteins, actually both, in their role of increasing insulin. Insulin does play a role in muscle growth. It plays a role in getting proteins into the cells, so we can't ignore the positive effect of insulin in this case. So if you're trying to gain weight, my suggestions are usually, keep eating a normal amount of fat. You may want to drop it a little bit in lieu of eating a little bit of extra protein and maybe a little bit of extra carbohydrates, or at least being mindful of carbohydrate consumption post-exercise to make sure that we get that increase in insulin to help with the adequate recovery and therefore potentially muscle growth. And this is all kind of what I was just talking about. There is on this website here, which is my own homepage website, I have a link to a whole bunch of different articles that talk about different nutritional strategies to gain muscle. Again, just like with weight loss, there is a whole bunch of different opinions and strategies out there. Some might work for you, some might not work for you or your clients. So, be mindful. And it does depend on that stimulus, absolutely. But once you have that stimulus your muscles want to grow, then gaining the muscles just is a matter of eating well and eating smart. So, all right, we're done with the weight management talk. It was a long one, but hopefully it was informative.